On average, it takes 9 to 15 years of untreated illness to be diagnosed with and treated for a primary immunodeficiency. Recent studies estimate that 70 to 90% of those with PI do not yet have a diagnosis. You're listening to Undiagnosed, an Immune Deficiency Foundation podcast. These are the true stories of the harrowing journey to diagnosis. For those without rare diseases like primary immunodeficiency, it's easy to assume that a harrowing diagnosis is the single complication that defines the struggle of their life. This is almost never the case. Life persists. The financial, familial, and professional problems that almost everyone has experienced don't just disappear when you're diagnosed. They are substantially amplified. The story of Matt Lesser is one that's marked, of course, by persistence, but also by vulnerability, self-reflection, and hard-earned humility.
So grew up in a small lake community just north of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Spent the first years of my life in the Chicago suburbs and then up in Wisconsin. Family moved here when I was 4. So growing up for me, I guess a fairly typical childhood, other than I was sick a lot. And then in my teenage years, when I was 15, I was diagnosed with ITP. And I was originally admitted to the hospital with a platelet count of less than 1,000. And so spent the better part of a year basically in a hospital, confined to a bed with very little activities. I was in and out of the hospital, but I was very restricted in activities. That's where I think a lot of things happened that year. So I was going into my freshman year of high school. And prior to that, I would say that I was a kid that was basically just living a kid's life with very little thought to the future. That year, I was homeschooled because I wasn't allowed to go to school because there was too many risks of fall or illness or whatever. And so really taught me to really think differently, I guess, about life. And I view that year as the end of my childhood. And so from there forward, I had difficulty fitting in with my peers and so forth. But I don't. And so I'm grateful for that year in many ways because it taught me a lot about life and it taught me a lot about perseverance and resilience, the importance of fighting. And so from there, I had treatments every year, actually the same treatments that I have now, believe it or not. But for a different reason. And so after that, about a year later, it went away as mysteriously as it came. I still have my platelet count is still low compared to normal. I'm always below normal, but I can live life fairly normally.
ITP, or immune thrombocytopenia, is an autoimmune disorder characterized by low platelet counts. Matt's subsequent year of trauma left him with a trait all too familiar to anyone who suffers from mysterious medical symptoms: an acutely heightened awareness of the fragility of life. For Matt, such insight came with growing pains.
I would say, as I look back on my life, I look at it. There are definitely these mile markers, events in my life where I can tell you that it was life altering in some way, shape, or form. It was life altering. So when I had ITP as a teenager, going into that, I was all about fitness and all about sports. Growing up, I was the overweight kid that was always picked last for gym class or whatever it was. And so I didn't want to be that way. And so in 7th grade, I found soccer, started to get in shape. And by the time I was going to my freshman year, I was bound determined to be a starter on the varsity squad my freshman year. And I was good enough that I would have been. And so I went in my freshman year in the best shape I'd ever been in. And then I got sick. So the first 6 months so I literally was admitted to the hospital 2 weeks before school was supposed to start. It was in August of, I think, 87. And so here I was now in a hospital. I can't play sports. And I'm pissed. I'm just royally pissed off at the world, right? At everybody. Because I had worked so hard for this thing, right? And so going through that, and at about the 6 month mark, I was in and out of the hospital for the better part of a year. At about the 6 month mark, I had I call it an epiphany type moment where literally it was the middle of the night. The treatments I was getting gamma globulin, which is what I'm getting now, but I was getting it through IV. Um, and so I was getting these concentrated doses every week, and it would make me terribly sick. So terrible headache and vomiting almost every time. Now, what I did learn is over time is if I drank 2 gallons of water during treatment, I didn't get sick. So I learned to drink 2 gallons of water a day. But anyway, this was so about 6 months into it, I had a treatment. I was really ill, getting back into bed in my hospital room. I was all alone. My parents had gone home. And as I'm crawling to bed, I had this thought. And the thought was this, and it's like, and I had this conversation with God, and I just said, God, here I am. I'm ticked at you. I'm ticked at my parents. I'm ticked at my body. I'm ticked at everybody. And you're the one person that could actually heal me from this. And so guess what? I'm done fighting. I'm done being angry. And I'm just going to turn it over to you and just see what happens. And so people ask me, were you healed that night? And the answer is I was not healed physically, but my perspective changed immediately. And from that point forward, I began to have a different view of my illness. I began to have a different view of, my reason and purpose for being here. I began to realize, you know what? I almost died multiple times as a 15-year-old kid. And here I am worried about playing soccer. And so from that point forward, sure, I still played soccer and basketball. I love sports, but I didn't have the same, it just, that they became an appendage to my life. They weren't the focus of my life. And so my focus changed. My focus changed on, okay, why am I here? What is my purpose? What am I supposed to be doing here? Okay, for all intents and purposes, and I heard this from multiple doctors, they couldn't understand why I was still alive. They'd never seen a platelet count that low, and they said you should have spontaneously hemorrhaged out and died. So they couldn't understand it. But it took me 6 months to get over myself, to get past my own self-pity, if you will, and wallowing in that before I began to realize, okay, wait a minute, there may be something more for me to do in my life. And so that's what changed for me during that year. But when I went back to school finally, I had a terrible time fitting in because I didn't think like my classmates thought anymore. And it was just yeah, it was a difficult time. So the next 2 years of high school, I graduated my junior year just because I just had a terrible time fitting in. And so I took extra classes so I could get out of there. I love college. I fit in there, but I was a different mindset, I think. So I don't know.
After earning his degree in business, Matt married the longtime girlfriend he'd known since elementary school and went to work at his family's company, a Midwestern oil distributorship ran by his father. Soon, however, he began to feel as though his place was elsewhere. When he tried to quit the family business to follow his own path, his plans were soon shattered by a trauma that would come to shape how he would see the world for the rest of his life.
I studied business in college, grew up in a family business. And a year after college, I needed a job, but I didn't necessarily want to work in the family business. My dad and I just didn't see eye to eye on many things, but I needed a job. So a year later, I went in to resign, and he flipped the table on me, and he left. And so here I was, a 25-year-old kid with a business, and a father that just left. And so I felt responsible for the business, for my mom, whom he divorced, and then my youngest brother. And the business was in shambles, and I didn't know that. And so it failed after about 120 days in the saddle. It failed, and I got super sick, and I spiraled into a very deep and clinical depression. Became suicidal. I got to the point where I wasn't getting out of bed. So the first thing that happened is I began to experience the more that I uncovered in the business, and it was like each discovery was bigger than the last. And I finally got to the point of realizing, guess what? This ship's going down, and I am the captain. And so it started with panic attacks. It started with just anxiety, then not sleeping, then panic attacks. Then I didn't get out of bed. And if I did get out of bed, I mean, literally, it was one of those things too. At this point, I'd been married for a year, And I didn't know what it was to be a husband. And so, I thought I had to be this macho guy that was protecting my wife from all the bad things going around. And so what I would do is I would get out of bed in the morning and then I would leave the home and I'd either wait until I knew she went to work, then I'd come back and get back in bed, or I would just go sit in a park and sit in my vehicle all day and just kind of stare. I didn't really do anything because I didn't know what to do. Life was so overwhelming. I didn't want to be around a phone because I was afraid every time the phone, literally, when I was still in my office, the phone would ring and it was usually a debt collector. And luckily, I had a bathroom just off my office, and so I got to the point the phone would ring, I go throw up, and that was my reality. And so I just stopped going to the office, and then I just continued to spiral down darker, 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 deeper, deeper, until finally, about 6 months of that, I got to the point of I didn't see any way out other than ending my life. And so that was what I was going to do. And so I actually got up. So this all started in July of 1997. And so by February of 98, I was suicidal. And so I actually went to my office and I was going to write 3 letters, one to my mom, one to my wife, one to my mom, one to my little brother. My mom, I had hired my mom to work for me actually, and so she was actually trying to keep things together while I was sick. And but I had this thought before I wrote. Not one letter on those letters ever got written, by the way. I had this fleeting thought before I wrote it, and that thought was, you know what? I know my parents took out a life insurance policy on me when I was a kid, and so it was probably one of the first logical thoughts I'd had in months. And but rather than calling my life insurance agent, and I wanted to make sure that that money was going to go to my wife and not my dad. And luckily I checked because it would have actually gone to him. And so I drove to my life insurance agent's office. He happened to be in. He was a lifelong friend of my mom's. I changed the beneficiary to my wife, and I was also trying to fish around for a suicide exclusion clause, but I don't remember ever using the word. And so, but whatever happened, I left. In the time I drove back to my office, 3 blocks away, he called my mom, and I didn't know this till years later. He called my mom, and he said her name was Jean. He said, "Jean, he's like, I know things are tough. I know that you're trying to figure everything out." Because he knew my dad had left. And it's like, but none of that matters because I just saw your son. And if you don't do something today, he will not be here tomorrow. And so she hung up the phone and she called the only other person that she knew of that went through something very similar, actually a decade prior to when I was going through it then. And he was in his office and he said, bring him right over. And so I got back to my office. My mom literally met me at the door and said, "Hey, let's go out for tea," which we would do that. And we hadn't been out for tea in a long time. I said, "Okay, fine." And she's like, "I'll drive," which was odd. I always drove, but I didn't want to fight. So I said, "Okay, fine, you drive." And so we got in the car and we started to drive. And rather than going straight on the road to get tea, she turned left. And I said, "Where are we going?" And she said, "To see a friend." And I said, "What friend?" And so she's like, "You'll see when we get there." So we got there, we pulled in this guy's office, and I had grown up with this guy's kids. He's a very, very successful businessman in our community. I grew up with his kids. And the only thing I knew about this guy was that he was tall, deep voice, very successful, and he scared me. And so I said, "Yeah, I'm not going in there." And she said, "Well, he said you might say that." So he said he'd come sit in the car with us. And so I went in and we spent basically, I think, 6 hours with him or 4 hours, whatever it was, the rest of the day. First thing he did is he got me help. And so I was removed from everything for about 3 months. And then while I was out, he sent a team of people in to see what we had. And luckily, we had enough because of the way everything went down. We had enough to start over. And that's how a new company was formed then about 6 months later. When I finished meeting with who wanted to become my business mentor, right? The guy who walked with me through from that point forward in my depression. I was taken away, not taken away. I volunteered. I went away, let's put it that way. And then he called my wife and he met with her and told her basically the story that I wasn't telling her. She knew that things were tough. She had no idea how big of a mess and how effed up this was. And he unpacked that for her. And obviously that threw her big time. And she didn't, and that created a huge breach of trust in our relationship because, I thought I was protecting her and she felt like I was pushing her away. And that was one of the first things that came out. And then as I began to heal through it, So I went there was a period of time where I had very little, I didn't have any contact with anybody, right? I just had to get, actually just had to get medicated and try to get my chemicals in my brain, the serotonin. I was just a constant fire mode, right? My receptors were all fried. And so, but as that started to get a little healthier. Then I started to engage with my wife, and primarily just her for a while. And so at first it was just, I think, weird. We just kind of existed together. And then basically then there was this breaking point, and I think it was about the 6 month mark. I was beginning to wean off the meds because I was getting healthier and healthier. I came home from work one night, and my wife's on the couch, and she got home earlier than me that day for whatever reason. We didn't have kids yet, and she's on the couch and she's crying. And so, I initial, and it was like a sobbing crying. It wasn't like the, little. And so I'm thinking, okay, who died? Or what happened, or who had an accident, or whatever. And so literally, when she composed herself enough, she looked at me and she's like, I don't know who you are anymore. And what that meant, after we talked about it and now reflecting back on it, what she really meant was, I knew this person that I married. I married this cocky, arrogant prick, basically. And she probably used different terminology, but I know that's what she means. So, but I was known, right? She knew I loved her. She knew I cared about her, but she also knew I was this cocky, arrogant prick. And she's like, and now she's like, the cockiness is gone. She's like, sure, I see glimpses of it. She's like, the arrogance is gone. She's like, and you're no longer a prick. And she's like, and you actually care for people. And she's like, I don't know what to do with any of this. And she's like, the bigger issue is I don't know where I fit in it. And so from that point forward, we started going to counseling together, and we went for 5 years together. Honestly, it was probably it was the best investment in our marriage, because we had 5 years together to build a new foundation for that. So it just began a different conversation, and it began a different level of trust in our relationship. And one of the things that I think that we've both agreed to is that when we don't know the answer, we don't pretend to have the answer. We ask for help.
By the age of 30, Matt had been diagnosed with ITP, left alone with a failing business, and given institutional help with depression that nearly killed him, all while managing bizarre and recurrent symptoms due to his undiagnosed primary immunodeficiency. By 40, the symptoms were far too severe and persistent to ignore. As is often the case in the story of Matt's life, help soon came from a friend.
And now we're talking about, I was in my probably my lower 40s, my mid 30s to lower 40s. I started to routinely get sick, primarily sinus infections, and they were nasty ones. Almost always required antibiotics. And so I would go on antibiotics for 7 to 10 days, and I would be fine for maybe 2 weeks, and then I was right back on them during certain times of the year. And there was just no relief for that. And over time, then they began to get more severe and more frequent. And then into my mid 40s, actually probably my early 40s, they began to then progress into my lungs, and I started to get bronchitis and then pneumonia. And literally by the time I was my mid 40s, anytime I'd get a sinus infection, it would turn to pneumonia. And then COVID hit, and I had COVID 6 times in 1 year. One of my best friends is a family doctor, and he was the one that was treating me all these years with antibiotics. And literally, we had to get to the point where he was layering in up to 3 antibiotics at the same time, just to fight off the infection that I was facing. And he finally got to the point in, I think it was December of 21, where he said, I'm tired of seeing my friends suffer, and so I'm referring you to a hematologist. Now, we had been looking for answers. I started going to a holistic doctor 5 years ago, or I'm sorry, 7 years ago. Went to a holistic doctor to try to find answers for all these sinus infections and being ill all the time, being sick. I just felt like crap all the time. Even when I wasn't sick, I didn't feel well. Had no energy. My wife would tell you that, literally I get home from work and I maybe have dinner before I'd fall asleep on the couch. And that was my life. And I was healthy, I was fit, I exercised, but I just felt like junk all the time. And so I went to holistic doctors, I went to specialists. I can't tell how many times I've been poked and prodded and had samples and tests and scopes, multiple scopes, and I've had liver biopsies, I've had my lungs scanned. I don't know how many times. I'm probably a walking radiation machine. And so, because just trying to find answers to what's going on, I've had my sinuses examined, MRIs, CAT scans, you name it, I've had it done. Um, no answers. And so blood work was usually fine except for platelets, but my blood work was always normal except for that. So December of 2021, my friend says, my doctor friend says, I'm tired of it. I'm sending you a hematologist. And I said, do you think I have cancer? And he said, I don't, but I don't want to rule anything out at this point. But he says, you're just getting sicker and sicker, and they're getting more severe, more frequent. And he's like, and we're at the point that I'm afraid you're going to be resistant to all antibiotics. And so he said, we got to figure something out. So went to a hematologist, and he did a whole series of blood work. Well, one of the things that he tested was IgG. Now, interestingly enough, my holistic doctor I started seeing like 5 years prior to that tested me for IgA. I had none. It kept consistently coming back to zero, or less than five, or whatever the rating was. And so that was always a red flag. It's like, okay, well, that explains maybe some stomach issues. So, I've always had issues with my stomach and bowels and all that jazz. Anyway, so this hematologist studies, takes a whole bunch of tests and tests for IgG. It comes back at zero. And so at that point, he said, okay, he's like, he's like, you don't have cancer, but he said, this is not in my wheelhouse. I'm referring you to an immunologist. And he said, there's something wrong with your blood. And he says, but I don't know what it is. And so I had already been seeing this asthma and allergy a doctor as well. Again, trying to figure out answers. One more doctor in my list. Um, and so I called him up and I said, hey, are you also an immunologist? And he said, actually, he says, I am. He said, I just don't advertise it much because I can't make money at that. But he says, yes, I'm actually an immunologist and I prefer that. And so I said, okay, I got one for you. And I said, I don't know what's going on. And so the first thing he did is he tested all the IGs. It came back zeros across the board. And he's like, oh, that's interesting. And so he said, I think you have something called CVID. And he said, interestingly enough, he's like, the replacement therapy is IgG infusions. And so then he explained to me, he started to explain to me, he's like, what happens is, he's like, you basically have only half of an immune system. He said, the IGs are your body's army. He's like, you don't have an army. He's like, you have the special forces with the T cells. And so he says, so when the body doesn't have the army and they have the special forces, then the special forces then are called in to do what the army is supposed to do. And he's like, but they don't do it efficiently. And so you get sick all the time. And unfortunately, then what happens is your T cells are distracted, and that opens the door to cancers and other things that will eventually take you out. And so he said, there's no wonder you're getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And he's like, unfortunately, if we don't start something, he says, your lifespan is going to be very short. And so we immediately started to do the research and started the application process with the insurance, which they denied it, denied it, denied it, denied it. It took us almost 6 months fighting with insurance before they finally approved it. I can't tell you how many appeals that my doc made. I actually had two different doctors making appeals. They were interviewing, they were demanding the review process, and finally it got approved. And so in July of 22, I had my first treatment. And it wasn't pleasant. I had pretty severe reactions for the first, I'd say, 6 to 8 weeks. A lot of dizziness, a lot of nausea, and I had the subcutaneous treatment through IgG. And my initial dosage was 17 grams a week, and which is now it's 20 grams a week. We upped it after a year, so 20 grams a week, every week for the last 2.5 years, 2 years and 3 months. And here's the thing. I have not been sick since.
Following his diagnosis of CVID, Matt's immunologist referred him to Dr. Charlotte Cunningham Rundles of Mount Sinai in New York in order to confirm the diagnosis and treatment plan. Today, Matt is healthier than he's ever been. He has written 2 books on leadership called Unsatisfied and Unengaged, with a focus on the importance of valuing relationships and vulnerability over unsustainable growth. He is also, understandably, a passionate advocate for the inclusion of immunoglobulin testing during routine blood panels.
I'm grateful. I wasn't grateful at first, obviously, but I am grateful that I had ITP. I'm grateful that I went through this depression. You asked me earlier what these have taught me. Going through the depression, in addition to teaching me that I need to rely on people and trust other people, it also taught me a level of humility there. And by nature, I'm not a humble person. Literally was if so when God wants to get my attention, he hits me instead of have the 2x4. As I get older, I'm trying to say, teach me before you hit me, will you please? But anyway, it's humility and empathy. I believe that we're all humans on a human journey. And the more that we can be real with each other and, open up our lives and be authentic and transparent, I think the better we can help each other. It doesn't do any good for me to sit here and say that my life's all grand and wonderful and everything's coming up roses when it's not true, and it's not true for anybody, right? We all have stuff. All of us do. And the more that we can share our stuff, I think the better we're all as humans.
Your support of the Immune Deficiency Foundation helps ensure that people like Matt have the diagnosis, treatment, and quality of life they deserve. To donate, volunteer, or learn more, visit primaryimmune.org.